As one of Africa's largest oil powers, Nigeria holds more than 37 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. Yet it still relies on millions of smallholder farmers to feed more than 240 million people, the largest population on the continent. The country has nearly every ingredient for a powerful agricultural sector: a tropical climate, vast savannas, and two major river systems flowing across the country. Yet behind its enormous output lies a critical paradox. Nigeria produces a great deal, but its yields per hectare remain low. So how can a low-productivity agricultural system feed Africa's largest population, especially when nearly 5 million more mouths are added every year? Today, join Agriculture Insight as we step inside Nigeria's massive food production machine, where millions of farmers race not only against each growing season, but also against long-standing constraints across the entire production chain. Let's get started. More than 70% of Nigerians could face a severe food crisis if cassava disappeared from every field. Thanks to its ability to tolerate poor soils and withstand drought, this root crop has become Nigeria's most important staple, with annual production exceeding 60 million tons, more than anywhere else on Earth, and equivalent to nearly 1/5 of global output. In Nigeria, each cassava crop begins not with seeds, but with stems from the previous harvest. Farmers select healthy stems, cut them into sections containing multiple nodes, and plant them in rows. From these nodes, young shoots emerge above the ground, while below the surface, some of the roots gradually swell, accumulate starch, and develop into clusters of tubers around the base of the plant. After about 8 to 18 months, depending on the variety and growing conditions, cassava enters the harvesting stage. Farmers cut back the upper stems, leaving a section of the base as a grip, then use their own body weight to pull entire clusters of roots, which can weigh more than 10 kilograms, out of the ground. When the roots are deeply embedded, they must rock and tug the stem repeatedly to loosen the soil, while minimizing damage to the large roots below. To this day, most of the harvesting process here still relies on manual labor. Farmers, most of them female smallholders, must lift heavy containers of cassava onto their heads and walk along the rows to load them onto trucks. Despite being the world's largest cassava producer, Nigeria's fragmented farming system, made up of millions of smallholder farms with limited access to machinery and an almost non-existent level of mechanization, has kept labor productivity extremely low. As a result, much of the workforce across the production chain survives on less than $1 per person per day. More importantly, the post-harvest time pressure acts like a ticking clock. All harvested cassava must enter processing within 48 hours. Beyond that point, naturally occurring enzymes trigger physiological oxidation, causing the roots to rapidly discolor, rot, and lose their value entirely. In terms of consumption, around 83% of harvested cassava is processed into gari, while high-quality cassava flour for industrial use accounts for only about 3%. Making gari requires the cassava roots to be completely peeled by hand, then grated into a soft pulp, pressed to remove water and reduce naturally occurring cyanide compounds, fermented, and finally roasted dry in large pans. By contrast, the small amount of cassava sent to factories passes through grinding and centrifugal separation systems, followed by rapid mechanical drying to produce refined cassava flour used as a raw material in the confectionery, textile, and pharmaceutical industries. The reality is that more than 90% of Nigeria's cassava production never leaves the country. This means the country could be missing out on hundreds of millions of dollars from the global cassava export market, serving the starch and bioethanol industries. In stark contrast to cassava, 250,000 to 300,000 tons of cocoa, often called brown gold, brings Nigeria into the global chocolate supply chain each year, generating up to $2 billion in export revenue. Yet beneath this boom lies a bitter mixture of hardship, hope, and high-stakes gambles. Deep in the dense green cocoa farms of southern Nigeria, the pods do not ripen all at once, so farmers must move from tree to tree, looking for changes in pod color that signal ripeness before harvesting each ripe pod individually. Pods growing low on the tree are cut directly at the stem, while those on higher branches are harvested with long-handled cutting knives to precisely cut the pod stems without damaging the flower cushions, the areas where the tree will continue to flower and bear fruit in future seasons. Immediately after harvesting, the cocoa is usually processed right on the farm. The pods are gathered into piles and split along the grooves of their shells with machetes, using just enough force to break through the thick husk without cutting too deeply and damaging the beans. Workers then use their hands to separate the entire mass of beans and surrounding pulp from the fibrous material inside. But not every pod that is opened reveals a reward. Cocoa needs rain and humidity to grow, but when the rains persist, those same conditions help black pod disease spread, turning the beans inside into dark brown, rotting masses. In one study conducted in Nigeria, black pod damaged around 22% of the pods recorded, and the figure could be even higher if the disease is not controlled. Even so, Nigeria's cocoa sector has not suffered the same severe climate shocks as those of its West African neighbors, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Most of Nigeria's cocoa still leaves the country as beans and raw cocoa materials to be further processed within the global chocolate supply chain, rather than undergoing further processing domestically. As global supplies fell short, Nigerian cocoa prices surged from around $2,200 per ton to nearly $11,000 by the end of 2024. For farmers who had long believed their cocoa was underpriced for years, this boom has truly been a rare, sweet surprise. With urbanization growing at more than 3% each year, and over half of the population now living in cities, soaring demand for rice has propelled Nigeria into the ranks of Africa's largest rice producers, with an annual paddy output of around 9 million tons. Yet behind this enormous production lies countless small rice fields that still depend heavily on manual labor. Because only about 1% of Nigeria's rice-growing land is equipped with irrigation, farmers are forced to sow rice seeds into dry fields and wait for the first seasonal rains to trigger germination. Around 3 to 5 months later, even a small field can require dozens of workers to harvest the crop by hand. They cut each clump of rice with sickles, tie them into bundles, and repeatedly beat them against metal drums until the grains separate from the stalks, a job that a modern combine harvester can complete in almost a single pass. The freshly threshed paddy is then taken to open drying yards, spread into thin layers, and constantly turned under the sun until it reaches a safe moisture level for storage. From there, about 64% of Nigeria's rice is still processed by small and medium-sized rice mills, where paddy is milled using relatively basic equipment, supplying the everyday rice consumed by the vast majority of the domestic population. But don't mistake Nigeria's rice industry for a collection of small local mills. At the Imoda Rice Mill Complex in Lagos State, an installed capacity of about 32 tons per hour allows the facility to process up to 240,000 tons of paddy annually when operating at full capacity. Instead of relying on dozens of workers to thresh, sift, and sort each batch, paddy moves continuously through an integrated processing line, from dehusking and milling to packaging. Most of the process is fully automated, setting a new benchmark for Nigeria's drive to reduce its reliance on imported rice. If America takes pride in the Texas Longhorn, a breed of longhorned cattle that helped shape the history of the American West, Nigeria has its own living legend, the white Fulani, a breed that accounts for nearly 50% of the country's total cattle population and serves as the backbone of its domestic beef and dairy supply. The name says it all. White Fulani cattle stand out across the dry savannas with their long, upward-curving horns and pure white coats. Their white coats efficiently reflect the intense tropical sun, while the dense network of blood vessels inside their massive horns functions like a natural cooling system. Combined with a fat-filled shoulder hump that serves much like a camel's hump, these adaptations allow the breed to go without drinking water for up to 3 days, and withstand the loss of as much as 20% of its body weight without collapsing. Yet despite its extraordinary survival genetics, around 90% of Nigeria's white Fulani cattle are still trapped in the cycle of traditional pastoralism. Following Fulani herders on foot for 15 to 25 kilometers each day in search of pasture, each cow produces only about 1 to 2 liters of milk per day. This modest but exceptionally rich milk is the exclusive ingredient used to make wara, the traditional white cheese commonly found in local markets. If you think chickens are the only major source of protein in West Africa, the piercing calls of flocks of white-breasted Guinea fowl may make you think again. With an estimated population of more than 40 to 50 million birds, Guinea fowl are the uncrowned king of Nigeria's indigenous poultry sector, especially across the dry rural regions of the country's north. Unlike fragile commercial chickens, Nigerian guinea fowls still retain many traits of their wild ancestors. They tolerate extreme heat remarkably well and forage for most of their food themselves, feeding on grass seeds, tender shoots, insects, termites, ticks, snails, and many other agricultural pests. They also possess stronger natural resistance than domestic chickens to many common poultry diseases. Most remarkably, guinea fowl are highly vigilant by nature. They serve as a living alarm system for rural households, instantly erupting into loud, piercing calls whenever they detect predators or unfamiliar people entering the farm. Because they are raised largely under free-range conditions with very little supplemental feed, the cost of raising guinea fowl is relatively low, yet their economic value is high. Guinea fowl meat is prized for being firm, lean, high in protein, and possessing a rich flavor often compared to that of wild game birds. Although their eggs are smaller than chicken eggs, they have exceptionally thick shells, significantly reducing the risk of breakage during transport from remote farms to busy urban markets. Located in Spain's Canary Islands, the 18th century volcanic eruptions buried nearly 1/4 of Lanzarote beneath lava and volcanic ash. Yet today, more than 150,000 people still live on the island, which is home to one of the world's most extraordinary agricultural systems. With annual rainfall of only about 150 millimeters, this landscape would appear almost impossible to farm based on rainfall alone. Yet on the very volcanic ash that once devastated the island, the people of Lanzarote harvest thousands of tons of Malvasia volcanica grapes every year. This grape variety is renowned for its ability to thrive in dry climates, withstand strong winds, and adapt to volcanic soils. But choosing the right grape variety is only part of the story. To make vineyards survive in this near-desert environment, the people of Lanzarote had to solve 2 major challenges at the same time: conserving moisture and protecting vines from the wind. Over generations, they developed an exceptionally ingenious farming system. First, they dig cone-shaped pits 1 to 3 meters deep through the volcanic ash so the vine's roots can reach the soil beneath. Next, they gather volcanic rocks scattered across the landscape and arrange them into semicircular stone walls around each pit to shield the vines from the powerful winds blowing in from the Atlantic Ocean. Thanks to the island's warm, sunny climate, The grape harvest usually begins in July and lasts through September, earlier than in most European wine regions. Because the vineyards consist of deep ash-covered pits, machinery is largely ineffective, making hand harvesting the only practical option. Farmers carefully bend down to pick each cluster of ripe grapes by hand before placing them into containers to prevent bruising during transport to wineries on the island. There, the grapes are sorted, cleaned, and gently pressed to preserve as much of their natural flavor as possible. Wineries such as Bodegas El Grifo and Bodegas Rubicon have worked with local vineyards for generations. This unique combination of cultivation and winemaking has produced wines with an unmistakable identity. Limited water forces the vines to grow more slowly and produce fewer grapes, but each grape develops a higher concentration of sugars and flavors. Combined with the mineral-rich volcanic soil, the result is wines with a distinctive mineral character and bright, refreshing acidity that have become the signature of Lanzarote. However, this farming system is not completely immune to extreme weather. Years with exceptionally low rainfall or prolonged hot winds from the Sahara Desert can significantly reduce yields. Even so, this agricultural system has endured for nearly 300 years and continues to thrive today, transforming a landscape once devastated by volcanic eruptions into a one-of-a-kind agricultural heritage preserved by UNESCO. Located just about 20 kilometers from the vineyards, the people of Lanzarote have long cultivated prickly pear cacti for a very special purpose, using their fleshy pads as host plants to raise cochineal insects, the tiny scale insects used to produce natural carmine red dye that was once exported throughout Europe. During harvest, farmers use specialized scraping tools to gently remove the white cochineal insects attached to the surface of the cactus pads. The insects are then dried and processed into a high-value natural pigment. At its peak in the 19th century, cochineal was one of the Canary Islands' most important export commodities, generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. However, after the introduction of inexpensive synthetic dyes in the late 19th century, the cochineal industry declined significantly. Today, it still survives on a limited scale, serving mainly traditional crafts, natural cosmetics, and cultural tourism. Many people think cacti grow only in barren sandy deserts, but in Mexico, the country's most productive nopal fields are rooted in young volcanic soils. Stretching more than 1,000 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt is the world's largest production region for prickly pear cactus. The dark-colored andesol soils found here are highly porous due to their pumice content, creating ideal conditions for the resilient root system of nopal plants to thrive. Farmers typically cultivate the cacti in long, orderly rows by planting mature pads directly into the ground, where they naturally develop new root systems. When harvesting young pads for food or picking ripe fruit, most of the work is still done by hand to avoid damaging the plants. Farmers wear thick protective gloves and use specialized knives to cut the pads close to the base early in the morning, when the natural acidity of the pads is at its lowest level of the day, giving the harvested product a milder flavor. With average yields ranging from 80 to 120 metric tons per hectare each year, Mexico's specialized nopal growing regions produce thick, crisp cactus pads that are rich in fiber, vitamin C, and a wide range of natural antioxidants. After harvest, workers use extremely thin, razor-sharp blades to remove the spines, then scrub the pads on flat wooden tables at the farm to thoroughly clean the surface before sorting and packaging. In Milpa Alta, the largest nopal-producing region in Mexico, annual commercial production can exceed 200,000 metric tons, making it the primary source of income for thousands of local farming families. While Lanzarote's vineyards take root in volcanic ash pits, another agricultural marvel unfolds on the western Canary Islands, where nearly 9,000 hectares of banana plantations cling to coastal mountain slopes in Spain's largest banana-growing region, and the only place in the country where bananas are produced on a commercial scale. Here, bananas are grown on terraced fields carved into the slopes of ancient volcanoes overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. These terraces transform steep volcanic slopes into stable farmland, reducing soil erosion and keeping valuable agricultural soil in place along the mountainsides, while the naturally sheltered terrain protects the plantations from powerful ocean winds, allowing the island's scarce irrigation water to be distributed more efficiently across each cultivated terrace. Thanks to the Canary Islands' mild subtropical maritime climate, bananas do not ripen as quickly as they do in hot, humid tropical regions. Instead, they remain on the plant for about 6 months, nearly twice as long as in many banana-producing regions of Latin America. Several months before harvest, each banana bunch is covered with a perforated plastic bag to help protect it from insects, while reducing exposure to strong winds and direct sunlight. Once the bananas reach the ideal stage of ripeness, the harvesting process is carried out entirely by hand and requires exceptional skill. Each bunch, weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, is cut with a specialized curved harvesting knife before being carried on workers' shoulders or transported via overhead cable systems to prevent bruising on the way to the collection point. From there, the bananas are transported to the processing facility. The bunches are placed in circulating water tanks to wash away sap and dirt from the peel, then carefully separated by hand into smaller clusters before moving through grading, quality inspection, and labeling lines. With an average annual production of more than 400,000 tons, Canary bananas have a high level of natural sugars and a smooth, creamy texture, thanks to their extended ripening period on the plant. Their exceptional quality has earned Plátano de Canarias the distinction of being the only banana in the European Union to receive protected geographical indication status, recognizing the unique origin and reputation of this volcanic-grown banana on the international market. One fascinating detail is that the tiny brown speckles that appear on the peel as the fruit ripens are not a sign of spoilage. Instead, they are part of the banana's natural ripening process on the plant, as starch gradually turns into sugar and enzymes continue working actively, a visible sign of the rich sweetness that defines this unique volcanic banana. Descending to the foot of majestic Mount Etna, the largest active volcano in Europe, we find more than 45,000 hectares of blood orange orchards in Sicily, Italy, where ancient lava flows have given rise to one of the world's most extraordinary citrus-growing regions. These orchards not only thrive on volcanic soil built up by Mount Etna over thousands of years, rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and numerous trace minerals, but also benefit from day-to-night temperature differences of up to 10 to 15 degrees Celsius during the ripening season. This rare combination stimulates the trees to produce anthocyanins, powerful antioxidants responsible for the blood orange's distinctive deep ruby red flesh. From December through May, the orchards beneath Mount Etna come alive with the busy harvest season. Every orange is carefully clipped by hand using specialized pruning shears close to the stem rather than being pulled from the branch, preventing damage to the tree, protecting the delicate peel, and preserving the quality of each fruit. Once harvested, the baskets of oranges are quickly transported to modern packing facilities to preserve their freshness. There, automated packing lines equipped with advanced sensor systems precisely weigh each fruit and carry out rigorous sorting. Only batches that meet all quality standards are awarded the European Union's Protected Geographical Indication certification before being exported to premium markets. If you ever have the opportunity to taste one, you'll immediately notice its distinctive, delicate sweetness, complemented by subtle aromas reminiscent of wild strawberries and red berries. A signature flavor created by the unique combination of volcanic soil and the Mediterranean climate, one that is extremely difficult for other growing regions to replicate. After years of land restoration, the first thing to appear on many former mine sites is not food crops or orchards, but cattle. The reason is simple. Even after reclamation, many mine lands still contain rock fragments, have low organic matter content, and lack the water-holding capacity of natural agricultural soils. While crops such as corn and soybeans require better soil conditions, forage grasses are far more capable of adapting to harsh environments. Taking advantage of this, engineers often sow large areas with mixtures of forage grasses and legumes such as alfalfa, clover, and orchard grass. Once the pasture becomes sufficiently established, farms begin introducing beef cattle, sheep, and goats for grazing. As a result, lands that are still undergoing restoration can begin generating revenue from meat production, breeding stock, and hay rather than remaining idle for years. Interestingly, in many places, these pastures are not the final destination, but rather a stepping stone to the next stage of development. With each grazing season, grass roots continue to penetrate deeper into the soil, livestock manure is naturally returned to the land, and organic matter steadily accumulates. Over time, the soil becomes increasingly fertile, creating a foundation for higher value crops and gradually paving the way for large-scale specialized agricultural operations. However, grazing pastures are not a perfect solution for every former mine site. Many areas still have thin topsoil layers and limited water-holding capacity, resulting in significantly lower productivity than natural agricultural land. As a result, overgrazing can compact the soil again, increase erosion, and slow the recovery process. One of the main reasons why many sites remain limited to pasture land instead of progressing to higher-value agricultural uses. If grazing pastures are the first stepping stone, then lavender is one of the most striking examples of how far reclaimed mine land can go. It is almost a match made in heaven between mine land and lavender. Land left behind after surface coal mining is often low in nutrients, but drains water extremely quickly, conditions that closely resemble the Mediterranean environment where this plant originated. In West Virginia, this concept has been brought to life by Appalachian Botanical. On approximately 35 acres of reclaimed coal mine land, the farm has grown more than 70,000 lavender plants, becoming one of the most well-known examples of transforming former mine sites into high-value agricultural land in the United States. However, bringing a plant native to the Mediterranean and growing it in the Appalachian Mountains is no easy task. Before a single lavender plant can be placed in the ground, the first step is propagating cuttings and raising them in specialized nursery trays for several months. This stage helps select the healthiest plants while reducing the risks associated with introducing young seedlings to a mineland environment that can still experience significant fluctuations in moisture and temperature. Once the plants reach the appropriate size, workers use earth augers to drill planting holes at consistent depths and spacing. This is especially important because the soil often contains large amounts of rock fragments and has an uneven structure. But lavender is not a crop that can be harvested immediately. It typically takes 2 to 3 years for the plants to mature and reach commercial production. By early summer, when the fields burst into vibrant shades of purple, the harvest season finally begins. Workers use sickles or specialized pruning shears to cut the flower stems just before full bloom, the stage when essential oil quality is at its peak. Interestingly, many of the people involved in planting, maintaining, and harvesting the lavender are residents of former coal mining communities who were directly affected by the decline of the coal industry and have now found employment opportunities in an entirely new field. After harvesting, the flowers are quickly transported to the processing facility to minimize essential oil loss. There, the bundles are sorted, trimmed, and fed directly into a steam distillation system to extract pure lavender oil. From that point, a wide range of high-value products, including soaps, skin creams, scented candles, and essential oils, are produced, transforming land once torn apart by coal extraction into a source of fragrance, essential oils, and stunning purple fields that attract visitors from far and wide. In addition to tangible agricultural products, reclaimed mine land is also being used to generate a very different kind of output: solar energy. Typically, every megawatt of solar power requires about 2 to 3 hectares of land. But instead of sacrificing productive farmland or converting natural areas, placing solar panels on former mine sites offers a win-win solution. The greatest advantage is the existing infrastructure, from major access roads to substations and transmission lines originally built for coal mining operations. As a result, developers can take advantage of infrastructure that is already in place, rather than building everything from scratch. One notable example is the Starfire project in Kentucky, where one of the largest surface coal mines in the United States is being transformed into an approximately 800-megawatt solar farm, capable of supplying electricity to hundreds of thousands of households. Even more interestingly, many solar farms on reclaimed mine land do more than just generate electricity. Instead of using machinery to control weeds, many projects allow sheep to graze freely between rows of solar panels. The panels create shaded areas that help retain soil moisture, while the grasses and wildflowers growing beneath them attract bees, butterflies, and many other pollinating insects back to the site. In return, this vegetation also helps cool the surrounding environment through evapotranspiration, allowing the solar panels to operate more consistently during hot summer days. Before coal mining began, much of Appalachia was covered by vast forests. So while grazing pastures and lavender fields demonstrate how reclaimed mine land can generate new economic value, commercial forests provide the clearest evidence that the ecosystem itself is truly recovering. However, for decades after reclamation programs began, a paradox emerged. To control erosion, many mine sites were heavily compacted by large machinery and then seeded with fast-growing grasses. This approach stabilized the surface, but it also made it difficult for tree roots to penetrate the soil, while dense grass cover competed aggressively for water and nutrients. As a result, forest recovery progressed much more slowly than expected. The turning point came when scientists introduced the forestry reclamation approach. Instead of compacting the soil, engineers deliberately loosened it through deep ripping to break up hard layers and maintain enough porosity for roots to develop naturally. The goal was not to create a perfectly smooth surface, but to recreate the conditions necessary for a forest to survive and thrive for decades. Once soil conditions improved, reclamation projects began planting high-value native hardwood species, such as red oak, white oak, black walnut, and black cherry. These tree species are widely used in high-end furniture manufacturing, construction, and the production of the bourbon barrels for which the United States is famous. Young trees are typically planted at densities of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 trees per hectare, creating natural competition for sunlight that encourages straighter trunk growth and improves future timber quality. Notably, a real-world finding from the University of Kentucky surprised many forestry professionals. On properly reclaimed mine sites, oak and pine trees sometimes grow 15% to 25% faster than those in nearby natural forests. While this may seem counterintuitive, the deeply loosened soil and reduced competition often allow root systems to establish more aggressively during the early years. Even more remarkably, these isolated minelands are becoming a refuge for the restoration of the American chestnut, a tree species that once dominated the forests of the eastern United States before being nearly wiped out by a fungal blight during the last century. For more than half a century since the wave of decolonization, Africa has always possessed a unique paradox. With nearly 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land and the fastest-growing young population on the planet, Africa has long been regarded as one of the regions with the greatest development potential in the world. In addition, the continent sits atop a resource base worth trillions of dollars, from gold, diamonds, and oil and gas, to cobalt, copper, and uranium, resources that play a critical role in the technology, energy, and industrial race of the 21st century. But Africa's greatest advantage is also its most critical weakness. Because for most people, the most important asset does not lie deep underground, but directly on its surface: land. The Sahara Desert stretches across more than 9 million square kilometers, dividing the continent from east to west, while many areas in the Sahel Belt continuously face drought, erosion, and land degradation. Agricultural productivity declines, people's incomes fall with it, and the cycle of poverty continues to spread like a vicious loop etched across generations. As a result, while much of the world is gradually escaping extreme poverty, Sub-Saharan Africa is accounting for an increasingly larger share of the world's poor population. However, instead of allowing the desert to continue determining its future, the continent has begun rewriting its destiny through an entirely different approach. From Senegal in the west to Ethiopia in the east, millions of people have begun implementing a solution that seems remarkably simple: digging small half-moon pits across barren lands. At first glance, they appear to be nothing more than scars in the middle of the desert. But from these tiny structures, millions of hectares of degraded land have been restored, millions of tons of food are produced every year, and the Great Green Wall has gradually taken shape. It is an effort to protect the productive foundation of an entire continent, as well as an ambition to narrow the development gap between Africa and the rest of the world. And to understand how African farmers and engineers have been able to transform barren lands into fertile fields, we must begin with the greatest enemy of African agriculture: water scarcity. The biggest mistake when looking at the Sahara is assuming that there is no water here. In reality, in many parts of the Sahel, annual rainfall is still sufficient to support agricultural activity on a certain scale. The problem is that most of that water does not remain long enough for crops to use it. After years of drought, overgrazing, and erosion, the topsoil gradually becomes hard and compacted. When brief rainstorms arrive, instead of soaking into the ground, most of the water quickly runs off across the surface and disappears. People may witness heavy rains lasting for hours, but just a few days later, the land returns to its barren state as if no water had ever appeared. This is also why many previous greening efforts failed to achieve the expected results. Since the 1970s, hundreds of millions of trees have been planted across the Sahel Belt to halt the expansion of the Sahara. But unlike the successes China achieved with the Green Great Wall along the edge of the Gobi Desert, most young trees in the Sahel could not survive beyond a few rainy seasons. Because the biggest problem was not the absence of rain, but the inability to retain water when rain arrived. And it was from this challenge that local farmers developed a solution so simple, it seems almost unbelievable. Instead of starting with trees, they started with holes. However, building half-moon pits is not simply a matter of digging holes. The first step is to accurately identify areas that have become degraded but still retain the potential for restoration. After selecting a suitable site, people mark thousands of positions using ropes, wooden stakes, or simple measuring tools. The pits are not dug randomly, but are arranged in multiple parallel rows running along the contour lines of the terrain. This design helps slow surface runoff across the entire slope, rather than at only a few isolated points. Only after that stage is completed does the digging begin. Essentially, half-moon pits are shallow depressions excavated directly into the soil in a curved shape with the opening facing upstream toward the direction of water flow when rainfall occurs. Each pit is typically only 20 to 40 centimeters deep and averages about 5 meters in width. Farmers use hoes or shovels to excavate the soil, then pile the removed earth into a small embankment on the rear side. At first glance, they appear to be nothing more than simple holes in the ground. But when thousands of pits are connected across the same slope, they begin to function as a massive rainwater harvesting system. When the rainy season arrives, surface runoff is slowed instead of rushing downhill. Water, sediment, and nutrients are trapped inside the pits rather than continuing to be washed away. Because most of the work is carried out entirely by hand, half-moon pits cost far less to implement than irrigation systems, dams, or large-scale water infrastructure projects. Viewed from above, the half-moon pits form countless miles of the desert, stretching all the way to the horizon. Once water, sediment, and nutrients have been retained, only one final element remains: the first seeds. After the first rains fill the half-moon pits, local people begin planting food crops, forage grasses, and native species with high drought tolerance. Depending on the region, these may include millet, sorghum, cowpeas, or tree species such as acacia and African eucalyptus. After only a few rainy seasons, the difference becomes clear. While the surrounding lands remain barren and nutrient-poor, the half-moon pits begin to turn into small oases that retain moisture for significantly longer after each rainfall. This gives young plants a crucial survival advantage. Plant roots have more time to develop before the dry season returns. At the same time, the sediment and organic matter inside the pits continuously improve soil quality year after year. As vegetation grows, a self-sustaining ecosystem begins to take shape. Plant roots help stabilize the soil. Leaves cover the surface and reduce the rate of water evaporation. Organic matter from fallen leaves continues to be added to the soil, further improving its moisture retention capacity. From this point on, the half-moon pits do more than just retain water. They create the first conditions for nature to restore itself. When people think of wheat, they often picture the fertile plains of the United States, Canada, or Ukraine. But in Xinjiang, the story begins right on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, which covers more than 300,000 square kilometers, where intense sunlight and extreme temperature swings are not just challenges, but part of the secret behind a wheat industry worth about $1.3 billion USD each year. Every June, when Xinjiang's wheat fields all turn golden, one of the largest mechanized harvesting campaigns in Western China officially begins. From early morning, fleets of combine harvesters advance in formation across the bright golden wheat fields. At first glance, the scene looks similar to large-scale wheat-producing regions in Kansas or North Dakota. But in Xinjiang, to adapt to the dry heat and vast farming areas, harvesting machines are often equipped with wider cutting headers, high-capacity cooling systems, and the ability to operate continuously for many hours. That is why each machine, more than 10 meters long, is equipped with a 7 to 12 meter cutting header to cut the wheat close to the stalk base, before the reel immediately feeds the entire plant into the threshing chamber. Right after that, a high-speed threshing drum separates the grain from the straw. The vibrating sieve keeps the heavier kernels, while the fan blows away dust and impurities. When the grain tank is full, the unloading auger opens and transfers the clean wheat into a truck running alongside the harvester. As a result, Cutting, threshing, cleaning, and unloading all happen in one continuous flow, turning the entire field into a giant harvesting line operating in the middle of a golden sea of wheat. But harvesting the wheat grains alone is not enough. The dry straw left behind in the field also needs to be collected to prepare the land for the next crop. In the past, this step required a lot of labor and time, but today, everything has become much easier thanks to straw collecting machines that can gather, compress, and press the straw into square bales right in the field. This not only saves time and reduces manual labor, but also makes the straw easier to transport, easier to store, and ready to be reused in livestock farming. Returning to wheat, after the harvest is complete, trucks loaded with wheat are immediately sent to weighing stations to determine the yield before unloading into receiving pits. From there, conveyor belts continuously move the stream of golden grain into storage facilities, where it is further classified according to preservation standards. From that point, this gluten-rich grain enters the milling plant and becomes strong, elastic wheat flour, the key ingredient behind Xinjiang's hand-pulled noodles, known for their long, soft strands, ability to absorb sauce, and distinctly springy texture. Besides serving as a staple food for local people, Xinjiang also earns millions of USD each year from wheat tourism. As the golden fields during harvest season become a major attraction, generating revenue from sightseeing, accommodation, and rural services. For more than 700 years, Hami melon has not only been a symbol of Xinjiang, but also a sweet example of how people have turned one of China's driest regions into an industry worth nearly 500 million USD each year. Unlike wheat, which can be harvested by giant machines, Hami melon harvesting in Xinjiang still depends on the eyes, hands, and experience of farmers. In Xinjiang, melons are often sweeter thanks to the dry climate, long hours of sunlight, and large temperature differences that help the fruit accumulate sugar more effectively. But for that sweetness to reach the right point, farmers cannot harvest them in bulk like grain crops. When the season arrives, they walk along each row, observing the rind color, the netting on the surface, the firmness of the fruit, the aroma around the stem, and the ripening marks where the melon touches the ground. Because Hami melons include both yellow-skinned and green-skinned varieties, each type must be cut at a different moment to preserve its own crispness, sweetness, and fragrance. That is why, during the hottest days, harvesting often takes place at night, when the fruit loses less water and maintains more stable quality before leaving the field. After harvest, the melons are sent to packing facilities to be graded, checked for quality, and processed into a variety of products before being transported to major markets. If Japan's Yubari King melon is famous for its luxury price, then Hami melon is Xinjiang's pride for the masses. Deeply sweet, produced on a large scale, and powerful enough to carry the flavor of the desert across China. Although it accounts for only about 2% of China's apple production, Xinjiang's Aksu apple is powerful enough to turn an arid region into a name that is sought after every autumn. Famous not only for its crystal-like sugar core, this apple also generates more than 557 million USD in economic value each year for Aksu. The Aksu apple harvest season usually begins much later than in many other apple-growing regions of China. Instead of rushing to pick the fruit as soon as it reaches commercial size, many farmers continue to keep the apples on the trees until late October, sometimes even after the first frosts of the season. This is the most important stage, when nighttime temperatures can drop below 0 degrees Celsius, helping the sugar inside the fruit continue to accumulate and creating the most famous feature of Aksu apples, a crystal-clear, translucent core. When harvest day arrives, each apple is gently twisted and lifted from the branch by hand instead of shaking the tree or harvesting in bulk with machines. Even a small bruise can affect quality, when the fruit has to travel thousands of kilometers to major consumer markets. After that, the apples are taken to preliminary processing points to check their color, firmness, and appearance. Those that meet the standard are wrapped in protective foam netting, packed into boxes, and then moved into storage facilities or sent to major distribution centers.